So my name is Ruth Harmon, as you probably can see from my little Zoom box. And I'm in language and literacy in the College of Education here, the Mary Early Frances College. But anyway, something like that. But anyway, so very happy to be here and very joyful to be in dialogue with my very good friend, Aliki Nikolaides, in conversation about her new fascinating book on generative knowledge. And so instead of kind of reading out a blurb about Aliki, I'm going to just ask you, Aliki, can you tell me something about yourself that you think would be interesting for this particular group?
To know about me? Well, welcome everybody. It's really lovely to be here today, and I'm super excited about this festival of ideas, particularly because it gives us space to poke at the fissures or at the periphery of how we think learning happens, or even how we create new things. And that really is a good way to introduce myself as a scholar, really an inquirer. I think I'm a lifelong inquirer into how do we make things different? And I've been convinced that we make things different by learning. And learning is this ongoing interactive dynamic play that I hope generative knowing is becoming. But I came to the University of Georgia in 2010 after spending almost 8 years in New York City, where I both studied and did my postdoc at Columbia University, where I immersed myself in the study of how adults learn. And I was really fascinated by how adults learn when there's no way to foreknow, right? So I'm really interested in uncertainty and unpredictability and emergence and complexity. And I studied the phenomenon of ambiguity because I'm really curious about how do we maybe decenter a rational, unilateral, directional, motivational kind of line of learning that is, certainly necessary, more informational and instrumental. How do we really make it different by looking at its ontology? So that's really where my theoretical explorations have been. It's been in the deep waters of the dark side of learning, so to speak, but not Darth Vader, but dark side where illumination also happens. So I've been here for the past 12 years, I guess, exploring this, and my book is a culmination of those inquiries and kind of giving me a space where I can put my ideas all together and then hopefully launch 1,000 more books, to use a heroic metaphor in a mixed way. Maybe that's a good first introduction, Ruth. What do you think?
Okay, that's really good. So I'm kind of interested, and I'm not in the adult education world. So your whole notion of generative knowing, how does it connect to you, kind of in terms of your particular life journey? And I know you talk beautifully about your parents. So how does the whole theory of generative knowledge connect to your own self and your own experiences? And then also, how does that connect up to the larger field of adult learning and education?
Sure, thank you for that question. I think that there are lots of ways I can tell my story. I can tell my story as a lineage holder of a particular lineage of people called Asia Minor Greeks, whose stories begin in the maybe Byzantium and the regions of what we now know as Turkey, and now Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, all the way down to Egypt. So we could talk about my story as a lineage of people, and I am of the generation of a lineage of people who are who have been nomadic. War, opportunity, conditions in society have made my peoples be resilient in their displacement. So I think it's important to know that line of my lineage, because that disruption, which is sort of in my DNA, really comes out in my choice of vocation of being a leader of learning, or somebody who is excited about making conditions where learning can happen. So from the place of loss and gain and creative opportunity, of which my peoples have done over and over again for, as far as my lineage goes back, I think it's no surprise that I chose a field where it's about creation, recreation, destruction, creative destruction, right? Like, how do we use the fodder of how we are in society ourselves. So that's kind of, my story is kind of grounded in that very fertile ground of asking, where do I belong? So my book tells stories of belonging in different ways as a way into understanding learning from its underbelly side. So in my particular discipline, learning is very influenced by philosophers of pragmatism and constructivism and humanism. And all that means is that there's a fundamental assumption that learning leads to something different or change. And that experience is really the epicenter of where learning comes out of. But what's interesting about that in my storytelling is that my experience has been so multifaceted. So what experience counts towards what learning? And so that's been an area for me of curiosity, because one of the questions I asked very early on was, why is it that my experience doesn't count? For example, so I'll give you an example. When I was growing up on the island of Crete, this is, in the 70s, I went to a school that was circular on an edge in Chania, which is one of the, if you know Crete, it's an island with two ears. Chania is in the middle of the two ears. And I remember being called a foreigner. I was xeni in the Greek language. And I never considered myself a foreigner in Greece. I was quite accustomed to being in Greece. And I was curious about that. Like, why was I the foreigner? Because I spoke other languages, because I wasn't born in Greece, because my parents came from Asia Minor. My father's from Palestine, and my mother comes from Transjordania, a period of time in history where Palestine was part of Jordan. So, why was I wrong? So I've been interested to know, how did we come to these conclusions about who belongs, who doesn't belong? And I think learning has been my pathway to understanding belonging. And generative knowing is an ontological theory about how being and becoming, which I think are at the center of belonging, get activated, get made possible. So maybe that's enough about my background.
Yeah. So in terms of like connecting up then to your teaching and your research within your field, how have you connected this up in terms of perhaps students' work or colleagues' work?
So one of the things that I've been I've done intentionally is to disrupt the way, the sort of the conventional ways that we think about learning. And learning in my field is very human-centric. It's very agentic. It's very oriented about the individual as the actor of their life, their creator of their life. That learning is a kind of a directional approach, that I can set goals, I can make plans, I can learn different skill sets, I can grow my mindset. Like there's a way in which learning in some ways has been colonized to produce things. And often a learning gets colonized in a particular way in which if we don't really intentionally challenge those assumptions, we just keep reproducing them. So I'm interested in, how do we create new pathways for learning to create new potential realities, right? New worlds. And in my field, there's an assumption that the self and society are somehow interconnected. That if I, the old adage, I don't know if it was Gandhi who said it first or Michael Jackson, look at the man in the mirror, this idea that I'm the only one who has the power to make change in the world. Well, that's an interesting assumption, that I can make something different out there when that which is out there doesn't want to be different. So I've been challenging this idea of how learning makes change, which is at the center of my particular field. Adult education is about creating the conditions for adults to participate in the democratization process and in organizational life. And what does it mean to be in society in a way where society has already determined what it is? And can I contribute to that society in different ways? And this is a beautiful moment for us to ask that question, because case in point, when we say we want society to be inclusive and connected and safe, and yet our gun laws are not promoting safety for all, it's an interesting bumping up against what we mean by society and how I get to participate in it. So I've been interested in challenging those interesting gaps. Like we say one thing, but we actually mean another. So adult learning has been really, learning is about creating the pathways to solving problems. Well, but what if the problems that we're solving are not actually the problems that need to be solved? And what are other ways that learning can be brought to be in dynamic play with reality in such a way that it is creating more just, more permeable, more inclusive, more multiplicities, so that self and society could be in greater, I don't want to say synergy, but like in a more dynamic mutual dance. So my field says it wants to do that, but in actuality, we have a lot of trouble doing it. And my students want to learn how to create change, but change based on what power, on what energy. And that's what I'm troubling. John Lewis, who was a senator of Georgia for many years and unfortunately passed away during the pandemic, used this language called getting into good trouble. So part of my theorizing has been, how do we get learning into good trouble?
So, Aniki, if I can kind of, follow on there, because you mentioned about, gun control and mass shootings and things like that. So, in terms of then interactions around that very serious, socio-political, social, emotional, psychological, and material process, so how do you connect up with that in terms of?
Yeah, so part of the so in a way, adult learning theories tend to follow a little bit of Maslow's behaviorist kind of approaches. Like there is a hierarchy, and what I'm doing is turning the hierarchy upside down, and then I'm saying, let's not pay attention to what's exterior. How do we pay attention to what's interior, in multiple interiorities, like the interiority of myself as a learner, the interiority of the space between us as learners, the interiority of multiple contexts. I'm an academic in an institution of higher education in the South. That's a context with multiple intersections. So how do we start to pay attention to the underbellies of these contexts, of which I am one, and how they're intersecting to produce something new, to create something new, actually, not use the word produce, but to create something new. So I know I used a very exaggerated idea here, which is the current, in the current American milieu, we have an issue with gun control, right? And we see multiple examples of that. So how do we stand in relationship to that? And my students, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build their capacity to stand in relationship to these multiple intersecting contexts, and not just be an observer, but to actually be a creator of something new. And that, by the way, is very difficult, because it's very difficult to unlearn our agentic problem-solving orientation to how learning works. And in many ways, as my doctoral students, because I predominantly work with graduate students, I'm trying to help them break frames. And what I mean is, not break them as break them. I mean, break frames that no longer can include the complexity of the reality and will allow them to find different responses to the challenges that they encounter, right? So being at the threshold of the complexity of multiple contexts intersecting. That's what I'm trying to build as a capacity, and then translate that into skills that make new things. And I know that sounds abstract, but it really is what it is that I'm trying to do. I have an example. One of my beloved students, now a dear friend, and working in a particular organization, and she has been charged with this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think is a really important concept. But how do we do it? And she's taken some of these principles of generativity, of ontological explorations and inquiry of how do we activate the potential of diversity, equity, and inclusion within an organizational context, not drive it, but activate it, make it find ways in order for it to become real. And that's generative knowing. Very different directionality. Does that make sense? Is that a little bit helpful?
No, yeah, very much. And so I was kind of thinking about that metaphor that your father used. I was thinking it might be nice to share that with the group. You know, in terms of,
sure.
I think it's also a really good example of generative learning, if you wanted to give that example.
Yeah, so let me say a little bit about what generative knowing is and how I define it in the book. And I just read right out of it, just so that if somebody says, wait a minute, you paraphrase your own theory. So let me not get into too much good trouble. So I think it's important to know what I mean by generative knowing, right? So I define it as ways of being and becoming. And why being and becoming is interesting is because I'm really trying to understand how do we get access to potential. And potential, and this is John Dewey's work, not my own. John Dewey, who was an American pragmatist, says, look, not every experience is educative. However, if we can be had by experience, in other words, taken by experience, there's the possibility that something new can be learned. That's emergence. So John Dewey was talking at a time where this was almost mystical language, which is why I talk a little bit about generative knowing as a mystery, because it's really hard to understand how do we get beneath experience. Well, being and becoming, which is ontology, is beneath experience. So how do we start to connect to beneath experience where something new can happen? So let's go to my dad's experience. So my dad, who is an immigrant to this country, was very, very fortunate to gain access to education, and then took that education and turned into a profession. And that profession took us back to all over the world, where he was able to provide for his family and create a lot of potentialities for us. And when he turned, and my father, who was born in Jerusalem, was displaced from his home in the 67, and actually before that, earlier, his family moved around a lot, actually. My father was born in 1931 between world wars. And there was a lot of disruption happening at that time because the region was colonized by actually the Byzantines, and then the Ottomans, and then the British. So this is sort of as the British are exiting Palestine, and Israel, the state of Israel is not quite yet formed, or is about to be formed. We don't know it's going to be formed, but it's going to be formed. Things are starting to happen and rumble. So my dad tells a story. He tells a couple of stories. So there's 3 stories which come to this Rid story. He tells me a story of one where his grandmother had a house in Jerusalem, and he lived outside of Jerusalem in a suburb called Katamun. And in order to go to visit his cousins, which were just like up the road, he would walk, right? That's what he didn't take his bike, he would walk. And he was walking one day to go to see his cousins, and along the way he was attacked by a gang, let's say, young people, and they started accusing him of being, I don't know, an instigator of trouble. I can't remember what he was saying, but anyway, and he spoke. My father at the time, he spoke 3 languages, right? He spoke Arabic, he spoke a little bit of Hebrew, he spoke Greek, and he actually spoke English at the same time. And at the time, he had the people who were, interrupting his walk to his cousins. I'm trying to use very inclusive language here. Spoke Hebrew, and so he spoke Hebrew to them. I said, "What are you doing? You are my cousins." He said this in Hebrew. And I said, "Wait a minute, who are you?" He said, "I live down here next to you. I'm going to my cousins up there, and don't interrupt my walk." So he spoke language, Hebrew. But further up on the same walk, and he gets attacked, well, he gets interrupted by another gang, only this gang speaks Arabic. And he says, in Arabic, "What are you doing? Why are you interrupting my walk? I'm going to my cousins." And they're like, "Oh, you speak Arabic." And so it's an interesting place where his way of being, multiplicities in a country of multiplicities, navigated really interesting potential moments where he could have been harmed. And then he tells another story where he's walking in the streets of Jerusalem, and somebody comes from behind him and puts a knife to his neck, thinking that he was of one tribe but not another. And he speaks the language. Again, he speaks Arabic. And he says, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this to me? I am your people." So there's this way in which my father is telling and retelling his story of belonging to this particular context and place and time, in a period of time, that is an interesting way to think about the experience of experience that gives shape to my father's story, which then comes to age 70. My father gets non-Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis. I'm the firstborn. We're rotating taking my dad to his chemotherapy. I'm taking him to his first chemotherapy. He says, "Stop." And I said, "Oh." He says, "I feel like a tree on top of water seeking land, like the mangrove, walking along land. I've done this all my life. I'm walking from one place to another place, seeking roots to belong." And I thought, what an interesting way for my dad to continuously tell, retell, shape, reshape, make meaning, remake meaning of his multiple lived experience of coming at the threshold of danger, right? And that's a really beautiful way of illustrating how our experience continues to generate new meaning and create new potentials. So that's one story.
Thank you. That's wonderful. That's wonderful image. I'm wondering, given that we have this amazing group of people here who are all interested in creativity, I'm wondering, is there any kind of prompt that you could kind of give to us so that we're kind of thinking about our own experiences, our own kind of relationship with the present moment at this point in time? It might be kind of a neat way to get people thinking about that, and then maybe perhaps opening up to some discussion.
Yeah, I think there's, I think maybe a few things just to think about, and maybe those are like good prompts, but also I'm happy to share with you I did a short, I did a métissage of my mom. It's a simple way of kind of connecting words or ideas. So maybe we can play that a little bit.
Nice, yeah.
But I think it's so interesting to think about. So in the case of learning, right? So how am I going to create? What am I creating with learning, right? Like that's my version of creativity here. Is that generative to me really is about activating potential creatively, and therefore allowing for multiplicities, multiple meanings, multiple contexts to intersect and make something different. And I use making something different really is a different way of saying change, because I I really want to sort of decenter the assumption that learning leads to change. Sometimes learning does lead to change, like solves a problem. I can get all the information I needed to take my exam or whatever. I mean, there are lots of ways in which learning works very, very well in a pragmatic way. But I'm trying to say, how do we get access to the multiple potentials that exist in our experience that then that learning can make into something different in the world? And so I want to sort of highlight this idea that potential always exists. It's already there, right? It's not, I don't have to create potential. Potential is everywhere. That's what complexity science teaches us. It's like there's everywhere there's potential. However, how do we open up or activate or make dynamic or play with potential? That's where I'm hoping generative knowing leads us, that it gives us the crumbs along the way to activate potential in such a way that it actually aligns with our intentions, whatever our intentions are for ourselves and society, a little bit more textured, more capable of actually becoming something. So I think that might be something for us to play with. And I played with that when I was kind of thinking about my mom's story. And so I'll read to you this short métissage that I did in June 21. And this came out of a prompt that a scholar friend of mine from Italy sort of mentioned around how do we tell stories, or what are our narratives? And it just struck me that there was a way in which I could tell my mom's story differently. So let me just read this to you, and then maybe it'd be a nice thing to bring everybody into a small group and have a little discussion before we keep going. So I say this, a single story is a dangerous narrative. I am of my mother, but my father is honored by the taking of his name and the putting aside of the mothering lineage that gave seed a place. To tell another story, to reorder a story, to unstory a story, for only one narrative is a dangerous thing. The story of seed takes place in fertile home, becoming what its seeding desires, many potentials. One story is too dangerous when fixed in time in the words of one storyteller. Breaking the story while telling it may be closer to what the old bards did before the story was put into stone. The stone becoming narrative is dangerous. No one stone is the same, no one narrative either, even when the story is told the same way every time. There are multiplicities locked in stones, remembering differently as stones skip across the molten surface of living. The rupture is not dangerous. It is how wounds heal, truth flowing before it becomes another stone for another telling.
Beautiful, Vicky.
Thank you.
Somebody has their hand up, I think, or somebody's clapping. Maybe Zach is clapping over there.
Well, we thought that we might, instead of talking at you for the whole time, maybe we can put you in little triads if possible, to have a little conversation of anything that I've said that stirred something in you, because that's also something about this book. I want it to be a stirring in you. This is the beginning of a theory building. It is not the way it is. It is a becoming. So I wonder if we can have a little conversation in smaller groups, and then maybe generate some questions that might kind of, activate some new ideas.
Yes, so
all right, I'm going to go ahead and break people into breakout rooms, and we'll come back in 6 or 7 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, here we go. I left those of us that were co-hosting out of the room so that people could have their conversations.
That's right.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you. Ruth, did I miss somebody who raised their hand? Was there one there or not? Did you see somebody?
It was just someone applauding.
Oh, okay, right.
Are people entering? I guess some people are not entering rooms because they're not around, but
Yeah.
do you want to add a?
Yeah, you can broadcast something
Yeah, yeah.
to the rooms if you want to.
I just
Yeah.
put it in the chat. What is being stirred in you? I don't know if they can see.
I think, no, Aliki, if you go into broadcast message, in the, if you look at the breakout rooms in progress.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
you see down at the end there.
Ah, broadcast. Okay. Just send it out. Thanks for being here and taking care of these logistics.
Oh, no problem at all.
Hey, there's Jerry. Hi, Jerry.
Hey, Jerry.
Oh,
We've put some folks in a room. I don't know.
Jerry, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I was saying I was put in a breakout room all by myself.
Oh,
no.
let's put you in another room.
Yeah.
So they
Zoom
were
me
all
away.
randomly assigned. So
Oh, some people are not, they're online. but
people are not joining the rooms. So unfortunately, some people are getting.
Can you
I'm not
put
taking it
Jerry in
personally.
room 8? Or room 1?
Sure. There we go.
Okay, thank you.
You can actually see the green light.
I'm gonna move some other people.
Yeah.
Great.
Everybody's got a partner now, at least.
Yay.
excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to broadcast the message again, Aliki, just in case?
Oh,
no
sure.
one-
I
yeah.
can.
A good feature, that.
I wish it was like a verbal thing. You could just speak to them and it would just come through in their headphones or whatever they're listening through. That you could advise them like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't talk. There we go.
So did let's see, what time is it? So we can,
It will have been 6 minutes since we got everybody sorted into different rooms intentionally at 3:38.
okay.
Perfect.
So Aliki, how long do you want to?
Yeah, give them 4 minutes. In 2 minutes, we'll give them a little heads up. I'm hoping that people will have some questions and
I think they will when they come back. You know, the way it felt, you know, the way it's after lunch kind of period of time. So it's nice to wake people up a little.
well, we just lost a whole bunch of people, so maybe this is good feedback. Don't do breakout rooms.
Well, I think they are showing up in the breakout rooms instead of as participants here. I think that
Oh.
12 is the people who have decided not to join a breakout room.
Okay, got it. It's always, I find this, it's all, I'm trying to get away from PowerPoints, so.
Yeah.
Great.
But yeah, it's always it feels a bit risky, right? But I think there's no better way to tell a story, really.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to send a 2-minute warning.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So
And do
if you do you want people to share things in the chat window, or how would you
Yeah.
like them to?
Do you want to, is that okay?
Of course. course,
Yeah.
whatever you want.
So share insights, thoughts, questions in the chat, and we'll try to use that as a way to sort of take the conversation to the next level.
Or even just unmute themselves and say.
Oh, yeah,
what they
that's
want to.
that's a great idea. So do you want to do that, Ruth?
But darling, just to kind of it's
It-
kind of nice, they're not in the chat, but to actually say.
Yeah, I
things.
invite people to
Yeah.
offer their questions, their insights,
Yeah,
what's
I
being
think
stirred in
that'd be
them.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yay! Anna, we
And
haven't seen the improv at all. But I mean, improv has not been. Everyone has been too busy. I mean, I'm myself.
Right? Yeah.
It's just been a crazy period of time. I don't know why, but
And I will have to get together and have lunch or something and talk about how these things connect. I'm curious to know how
Yes.
these ideas are connecting with your scholarship as well. So,
Yeah. And also like the previous session focused on generative learning and your own
But-
generative knowing. And so
but
it's just-
so different, right? Because I was
Yeah.
in the session too, very different.
yeah.
All right, we are 30 seconds from closing all the
Okay.
rooms. I just sent them a notice.
Thank you very much, Amy. Really appreciate it.
I'm a planner. I love exact things. So this is fun for me.
Be careful what you say, Amy.
I know. I forgot he was here. All right, I'm going to close the rooms now.
Thank you.
Oh, it's telling me it will take a minute for them to close. So we have 1 minute.
That's okay. It's always really weird. I mean, I appreciate that Zoom does that, so you're not totally shocked, but. All right, folks are back, looks like.
yay! Welcome back, everyone. At this point in time, we would love for people to just unmute and share your insights, share what's come up for you, and then we can kind of spiral, into discussion through all of that.
Yeah, if someone feels so moved to ask a question or make a connection or sort of speak into the space, that would be great. Otherwise, I can keep talking, but that might not be so exciting.
We didn't really have a significant discussion in the breakout room, but we were talking about the definition of generative education, so forth. Yes, and for me, what I shared was that my perception is that everything we experience in life, all of our exposures and our perspectives come from the way we were brought up and the exposures that we've had to different situations. And to me, that's generative learning or education or whatever, because that's what we bring to the table. Those are the perspectives that we have. And if we've changed our perspective over our lifespan, it's come from some exposure to something else. So it goes back to the premise that everything that we're exposed to creates learning for us. And that's what we share or what we draw from.
Thank you for naming that and saying it in the way that you have. And where it becomes really interesting is, how do we pay attention? What do we pay attention to? And what we know from the way in which sense making and meaning making happens, sometimes attention skips over us, or we gloss over it, or we don't pay attention quite so much. So part of this ontological approach to learning is about slowing down, disrupting the rhythms that we have been, that really dominate the way in which we learn, right? For example, the way we do testing. is that really a way that really enhances our ability to pay attention? It's just a question. I mean, I'm not an educator in K through 12, and I was not educated in this country. So it may be that I'm wrong about the testing culture in this country, but it seems to me that we're in a way, yes, and how might we amplify the way that we pay attention to things differently and make meaning to them in multiple ways? So I think you're spot on there.
I think creating active participation and engagement for students. I do work in K-12 right now. I think that for the students today, it's about engagement. They are no longer wanting to hear lectures. They want something that allows them to participate in the process. And that active learning for them makes a difference in their ability to submit to whatever it is that they're going to be exposed to. Aside from that, they don't have an interest if it's not allowing them to participate in the process.
Yeah.
I didn't have a question about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thanks. I couldn't speak in my breakout room, so I've solved my problem. So thinking about that, what the previous commenter just said, I wonder about how the engagement in the process of learning tends to be about doing. Like, that's what I heard it when I heard it described just now. It's about doing, and yet you're saying there's more than just the doing, the producing. There's something about engaging in the process through accessing our different ways of knowing. And how might we teach that too from early on, so that when we become adult learners, it's not disrupting everything that we've come to know. I mean, I think that when I was growing up, I learned by being lectured at. And so we are making progress by engaging others in the doing, the learners in the doing. And is there a next iteration of this, which is engaging others in the just sitting with?
Yeah, Val, thank you so much. It's so good to see you here. Thank you for being here. I think that is that's what I'm trying. That's the disruptive move of generative knowing, is that it's not saying no to the active, participatory, directional approach to learning that we've all been embedded in for most of our education. It's also inviting that, adjacent to that is this slow, entangled, not quite sure what's about to emerge, not foreknowable part of knowing that also is important, particularly as we are encountering more opportunities where our current knowledge is not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So it is about putting into dialogue the doing dimensions of learning, which are extremely well researched and developed, with more of the being dimensions of learning that we're just starting to language and allow for. So, and that is one of the things that I try to describe, and it's really hard to describe this, is how do we do learning that isn't about the meaning making that comes from our cognition, right? Cognition is to cognize, but what if becoming is to allow and receive? And I'm not sure what the word for that will be, but I'm sure I'll make it up at some point. But, what is the receiving side of the becoming of knowing, not the cognition or the recognition side of knowing, of which we know a lot about? Jerry.
Hey, thank you. I would add some other things like acknowledgement. So when we participate with others, because sometimes a person kind of can bring in with them a sense of not being of value. So how do we convey value, dignity, respect, acknowledgement? I think we need to do this in our engagement of yes and with one another, that their voice has something to contribute.
Yeah, I really appreciate that view. I mean, those of you who have read my book or who will read my book, you will see I have actually 4 stories three of which, one is my own, my mother's and my father's, and then one is one of my now Dr. Lim, but previously RM Lim, my student. Now she's Dr. Lim, my colleague. And those 4 stories are a way of working with the method of generative knowing to reorder the stories that may have held us hostage or may have not included all of our identities and are somehow have been displaced in and of themselves. And that's part of what generative knowing is doing. It's taking that lived experience and composting it in ways that generate new sensations, new ways of being, new ways of becoming in the world. So I really appreciate what you're pointing to, Jerry. More of this, please. And yes, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it. Is it Nasheshe?
It's Nasishe.
Nasishe. Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to address something that Valerie said, as well as something that you said with regard to the disruption. I think the disruption in education right now is virtual learning. The infusion of that process into the learning environment is changing the dynamics of engagement of students. And so I think that that is a new disruption right now. And I want to also refer to something that I heard from one of the speakers on yesterday, where he had done surveys with students, asking them what had caused their lack of motivation or lack of engagement within the educational process. And it was interesting that all of them talked about, or many of them talked about, that they wanted to learn about something that they were interested in doing. If they were interested, for example, in being, a doctor or a therapist or whatever, they wanted something that would touch on that, or they wanted someone to ask them what they were interested in. But we're more focused on testing and the school dynamics as opposed to personal things. And another thing that was striking to me is that many of them said that they wanted to know what they needed to do when they finished school. What did they need to do to be happy? Who talks about that in school? That's not something that's addressed because we're so test focused. And so I think that we have to rethink the purpose of education. And in doing that, that will help to shape how we present to our students.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I didn't hear Chris Holmes' talk from yesterday. I see Anna just mentioned it. And I also, I have to apologize for my ignorance in K through 12 education. I predominantly work with doctoral students who are interested in facilitating learning in a variety of contexts. So let me just, name that. And I do also agree with you that, and this is part of my motivation, is that more and more learning approaches are trying to mimic machines. And I think it's ironic because at post-industrial revolution, learning and education was about us being able to systematize and make efficient learning as machines. And now we have algorithms who can out-machine us. So it's interesting, this idea of disruption is really important for us to pay attention to, because what is the space of learning now, and for what purpose? What does learning make? How does it make things different, like happiness? How do we create more ecologies for our flourishing, for our mutual learning? I'm not sure trying to now follow the dynamics of algorithms or machines are necessarily, or virtual reality they're here to stay. They're not going anywhere. But how do we not lose the place of becoming and being, which is not it is not a predictive process. It's not a facilitated process. Sometimes it's like we have to accompany our being and becoming. So how do we integrate that in all of our learning spaces, whether it's K-12 or higher education, where we can accompany the learning that wants to emerge? And I think that's the disruption I'd like to create in my classrooms and in the research that I continue to do.
So, yeah, so I mean, it's all wonderful. I'm wondering, is there any other comments that come that have come out of these moments together in groups or
Well, I can just jump in and just say, part of the potential of generative knowing is that it starts to reintroduce us to the sensations of, it's really about the sensations of learning that come out of the ground of our being. And I know that may sound a little bit too philosophical, but it is important, I think, for us to pause and slow the rhythm of learning down, in my view, as a response to the proliferation of the rapidity of change, the constant being on, the demands that are placed on us as adults and learners to continuously now compete with faster, more effective, more efficient, bigger, better. There's a way in which that force, that power is not sustainable, in my view. I don't see it being sustainable in my students, to be honest. And the idea that we can continuously to layer more and more onto our being and becoming, I think it's starting to collapse upon itself, and we need a little more space to disrupt that, to sort of say, no, thank you. So some of the ideas that when we talk about how do we create spaces of possibilities, well, these are some principles that you might want to consider. Like, how do we create constraints, intentional constraints, such as different kinds of timeframes and timelines? How do we create more inclusive ways of completing assignments even? How do we allow our multiple identities to be constraining systems that allow for emergence within our classrooms? For example, many of my students are working professionals and parents and carers of elders. How do I make space so that all of those identities can be part of the discourse, but also part of the work that we are in my own classroom, right? So we don't have to abdicate them or absent them. How do we create spacious freedoms? So maybe a way to use virtual reality is how do we create inclusion in multiple modalities so that all these identities can be not left behind? I have students who sometimes have to breastfeed. So how do they get to breastfeed and attend class, right? So these are interesting, human things for us to consider, but that are not built into a 16-week semester, 3 hours in the evening, blah, 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 right? Those are the conventions of how we do adult learning in higher education. And then the other thing is, how do we invite mutual learning? Because we know that in complexity, in possibility, nothing happens alone. There is no such thing as independent individual learning, that it is a mutual, entangled, bumping into thriving complexity. How do we amplify that so that we can build the skill sets, the mindsets, the ecologies that allow for the evolution of learning to happen? So, I invite you to experiment and to play with these dynamics in ways that may require us to decenter some of the things that we do normally, or even are asked to do in a very particular way, like student objectives or outcomes. These are things that are part of a neoliberal project that I'm not the one who designed those things. So how do we do these things in our classrooms or in our work with learners that start to build some of the capacity for being and becoming? Yes, I think Maria has it here. How do we slow down and experiment more, really? And I mean like multiple tiny little micro ways of doing things a little bit differently every day. Thank you for that comment.
Valerie, yeah.
Hi, Val.
Just a question about, or a comment, probably both. I'd love your thoughts on this. So you talked about learning as creation, And I think we often see it as learning as creation, learning as growth. We get bigger through our learning, right? And you've posed this idea of disrupting our learning so that we might access our learning in different ways in here. And I also wonder about, based on what you said in the very beginning about the containers that we tend to learn in, learning as destruction, and then your comment about composting made me think, yes. And so can you talk about that, kind of this creation, disruption, destruction, how you see that?
Yeah, there's a great, actually there's Richard Rohr is an Episcopalian priest, and he's lovely. And he coined this idea. He talks about order, disorder, and reorder. And I often use his language there because when we think about, all of us long for a kind of order because we think that's the simplicity on the other side of complexity. But actually the simplicity of the other side of complexity is to reorder order. And so when I talk about creative destruction, it's like, can we destroy our assumptions about how order works so that we can be a little bit more fluid and flexible and creative and desire and playful about reordering order in order to make something different? That's creativity, in my view. So, that to me is a way of making more space for possibility. How do we reorder the order that we seek?
So one thing is we can't reorder the time frame here, unfortunately. So we're actually, we have like one minute to wrap up, actually. Do you have any sending thoughts, Aliki? Just so wonderful to engage with everyone here on this incredibly important element of disrupting the neoliberal discourses that we're embedded in.
I think first of all, I just want to thank everyone for hanging out and paying attention for the while that you've paid attention, to really invite you into understanding, how do I create spaces of possibility for myself and all, where mutual learning can happen. And I think that spaces of possibility is a really interesting and inspiring way to think about creativity. And maybe that's the best way to end.
Grazie. Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me, and thank you at Torrance Festival of Ideas. It's really amazing. People here are doing crazy, amazing, good work. Thank you.
Thank you both, Aliki, for brilliant examination of your work and telling us your insights, and Ruth for hosting so beautifully. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
The next session starts at 4 p.m. All right, that's the last online session we'll have for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.